Let's continue our discussion about DevOps practices with another interesting subject called as infrastructure as a code. Now, this is really required where DevOps is practiced or where developers focus on automation. Infrastructure as a code is also sometimes termed as IAC, and it means managing and provisioning infrastructure using code and automation. With infrastructure as a code, instead of doing things manually to manage and provision infrastructure, we use automation. We use code to create and change things like servers, instances, environments, containers, probably clusters of containers, or an entire array of the stack of infrastructure that you're using probably for your web application. Traditionally, when you used to build servers, you used to build it with a graphical user interface, probably log into the virtual machine, probably log into that vSphere console and click on that file, new virtual machine, and then follow through the wizard. Today, time to market is a key, and it's very important to spin up the infrastructure quickly so that your customers can then see the output quickly. With infrastructure as a code, you can build from a simple design like a two-tier load balancer environment to a very complex architecture involving several entities. So if you're thinking about what does this infrastructure code look like, all of this really sounds magical. Well, with infrastructure as a code, you will just be working with a set of code or set of files or maybe configuration with the help of certain automation tools to actually perform those changes. You would then commit those files to, let's say, some kind of a source control, which would treat it like a code, and then use an automation tool to implement, act on those changes defined in that code. With infrastructure as a code, provisioning new resources as well as changing existing resources are things that are both done through automation. So why should you do infrastructure as a code? The answer is same for automation, right? So why would you choose automation? Only to avoid any human errors, isn't it? But that's not the only reason. You get consistency in the creation and management of your infrastructure resources. Automation has the benefit and do things the same way every time. Humans tend to do things a little bit differently each time. So you get a lot of consistency in terms of how things are done with your actual environments. At this point, I would like to add another point about reusability. When you use infrastructure as a code, you can take that code, make a little bit of changes on that file, and you can spin up multiple environments with the same set of configuration. Or if you need to make certain changes, probably sometime in future, you can use that code again. So you get scalability of code. Just for an example, let's say that you need to add a new instance to a load balance server. What you will do is just go to the code, make those changes, and you're ready to execute that. If you provision the existing instances using infrastructure as a code, you can take that code and use it to provision a new instance that is configured exactly the same way as the existing instances in a very short time. Probably may take minutes or seconds to scale up and down. I'll tell you another great benefit of using infrastructure as a code, yeah? It makes your infrastructure self-documenting. With infrastructure as a code, your infrastructure and any changes made to it are documented through the changes made to those code and configuration files that are used to provision the infrastructure and execute the changes. For example, the way that a particular server is configured can be viewed in the source control as compared to a traditional model. Understanding how the server is configured was a matter of, let's say, who logged into the server, what commands were executed, and there was a lot of problems in those traditional days. So infrastructure as service is simplifying the complexity. If you'd like to spin up complex infrastructure that includes several databases, maybe you need an authentication server, a file server, let's say an application servers, and then replicate those environments one after another, probably a test environment, a prod environment, a QA environment, then you know what to do. You will just write that as code and use that code to spin up that infrastructure quickly so that you have identical infrastructure for several business units and several environments. So with infrastructure as a code, you are making your life much easier because you can manage that complexity of provisioning and managing the infrastructure simply by the use of code. I hope you can now understand the benefit of using infrastructure as a code. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and understand about configuration management. The infrastructure in an IT environment is prone to changes. Changes are very normal in day-to-day life in an IT industry, and they always need to happen. We always need to make changes in our infrastructure to keep them updated, to meet changing business needs, and to make sure that your environment is ready for production usage. Configuration management is about doing those changes in a maintainable way. Configuration management is a way of minimizing configuration drift. Now, what is configuration drift? Now, configuration drift is the accumulation of all the small changes that are made to the system over a period of time, and then it may cause those systems to become different from one another. When you started with your IT infrastructure, you might have thought about the baseline of the infrastructure components. But over a period of time, there will be several administrators working on it. That means the build numbers will change, the minor versions, the major versions may change, and hence they may drift away from what we originally thought. So if you think about it, every time someone logs onto the system and makes a change, there's a chance that they have now made that system different from other systems that you manage, but rather it should have been standardized. So, configuration management is all about maintaining and changing the state of various pieces of infrastructure in a consistent, maintainable, and a stable way. Configuration management is about doing all those things in an automated fashion. So while we just spoke about drift and understood that drift is all about rolling changes from the point where we started and the point where we are today, and configuration management will help us minimize that drift by rolling out changes and managing configurations across a complex infrastructure in an automated and centralized way. The topic that we learned about earlier was infrastructure as a code. So you know what infrastructure as a code is doing, right? It is about provisioning infrastructure rapidly, whereas configuration management is about controlling that configuration. So controlling that deployment in an efficient way, in an automated way. So it looks like there is a close relationship between configuration management and infrastructure as a code. Now, infrastructure as a code is a very beneficial, very helpful tool that goes hand in hand with configuration management. So at this point, you may be thinking, what does this configuration management look like? So let's talk about that. As an example, let's say we need to upgrade a software package for a whole lot of servers in your data center. Now, what will happen without a good configuration management? What we would do as an administrator is log on to each server and perform the upgrade manually. The problem is this process can lead to a lot of problems. Maybe we forget about one of the servers because we didn't have a good documentation on it, and therefore the software package on that server was not upgraded. Or perhaps while we are in the process of rolling out those upgrades to a variety of different servers, there's a temporary version mismatch which causes something to break while we are in the process of manually doing that. Now, on the other hand, let's take a look at the configuration management from the other side. What we do is define a new version of the software package that we want in a configuration file or a tool, and then we use that tool to automatically roll the change out across a variety of servers within our infrastructure. So configuration management is about managing your configuration of all your server estate within a code on a particular server. And that server would then be called as a configuration management tool. All of this really saves time, isn't it? Because it takes less time to roll out the configuration from that centralized configuration management server, and you also get to see insights on that server. So not only are they able to roll changes out to all the servers, they give you insight into what the current state of your infrastructure is. So you will get a better understanding of what has been rolled out to your servers and what their configuration is at the moment. So configuration management is very good for maintainability, and this is very important because a maintainable infrastructure is easier to change in a stable way. Change always introduces the risk of instability. And that's one of the topics that we started our discussion on DevOps with, right? Ops team really does not like changes because it creates instability. And that's the whole reason we need to have controlled change to make your infrastructure maintainable and hence to reduce the risk. Configuration management minimizes the configuration drift. It means that it's easier to now keep a standard configuration across a whole array of servers when you really do not have to manually log into the servers and make those changes. So you are using automation to roll out those changes, and the configuration management server or a configuration management tool will help us do that. So the configuration management is very important tool for DevOps. A good DevOps infrastructure, specifically in the cloud, can become very complex, and you're going to need configuration management tools and servers in order to maintain that complex infrastructure in a stable and maintainable way. We're going to talk about orchestration a little bit in the next lesson, so that's when you will be able to join all the dots that we spoke about: understanding configuration management, infrastructure as a code, continuous delivery, deployment, and continuous integration. Thanks for your time so far, and I'll see you in the next lesson.